Elizabeth always loved autumn, its vibrant colors and soothing silence. But this autumn, something strange happened in her life. She was supposed to return to her hometown after a long stay in the capital. Elizabeth decided to save money by taking the night train, which promised to get her home in just a few hours. The train was old but well preserved. The carriage she boarded was almost empty. At the opposite end sat a woman in a long black coat, her face hidden by a hood. Elizabeth chose a seat by the window to enjoy the view of the night forests and fields. A few hours passed when the train suddenly stopped. The carriage jolted slightly, but everything was quiet. Elizabeth glanced at her watch. It was 3 in the morning. Outside there was a thick fog, and the light from the platform lamps flickered as if from another world. She noticed that the woman in the black coat was no longer in her seat. In the place where she had been, there was an empty chair, and next to it lay an old newspaper with the headline "Missing Ghosts of the Night Trains." Elizabeth decided to look at the newspaper, but then her attention was drawn to a strange sound, as if someone was dragging something along the floor. She turned around and saw that the woman in the black coat was back in her seat, but now her face was completely hidden under the hood. Elizabeth felt a strange sense of unease but decided to ignore it. Soon, the train started moving again, and they continued their journey. But Elizabeth noticed that the fog outside was thickening, and the forest around them became darker. The feeling that the train was moving into infinity grew stronger. Occasionally she heard rustling and strange sounds, but these could be attributed to the old carriage. When the train stopped again, the fog outside was so dense that it was impossible to see any stars or roads. Elizabeth looked around and saw that the carriages had started to look different. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, and the seats were torn and looked long abandoned. She approached the door to see what was happening, but it wouldn't open. In panic, Elizabeth began to knock and shout, but no one answered. Then she turned back to the woman in the black coat. But she had already stood up and approached her slowly and silently. "Who are you?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. The woman raised her hood. Her face was pale and empty, like that of a corpse. There was nothing alive in her eyes, only deep darkness. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "This train only goes in one direction." At that moment, the train jolted and it started moving again, but now at a horrifying speed. Only flashes of light and shadows passed by the windows. Nothing else was visible. Elizabeth felt herself being pulled into an endless tunnel and realized that she would never return home. Story 2. The Quiet Stop. Mark had always been skeptical about legends and myths, but his adventure on the night train changed his views on reality. He often traveled for work on late trains and knew all the routes by heart, but that journey he was about to describe was special. His train departed at 11 p.m., and the route to the final station was rather secluded, passing through old, forgotten forests. Mark took a seat in a carriage that was almost empty. He noticed that the seat by the window was rather uncomfortable but decided not to pay it any mind. A few hours passed, and Mark began to notice that the train seemed to be moving slower. Strange lights began to appear outside the window, which couldn't have come from street lamps. They were dim and flickering, like reflections on water. Strange silhouettes flitted through the forest, and Mark felt that something was wrong. Soon the train stopped, but there was no one on the platform. Mark got off the train and discovered that the station did not exist. All around him was only dense forest and fog that enveloped everything. He approached the only building, which looked abandoned and half destroyed. Mark decided to return to the train, but the carriage door was locked. He noticed that there were several other carriages around the train that looked much older and more worn out. Trying to open the doors, he heard strange sounds from inside, as if someone was whispering, laughing, or crying. He managed to open one of the doors and entered a carriage that was filled with old suitcases and furniture. Inside, he found many antique items that clearly did not belong to the modern world. Suddenly, one of the suitcases opened by itself, and Mark saw an old diary inside. He began reading the entries in the diary, which described night journeys and strange occurrences experienced by people who had boarded this train. All the stories ended the same way: passengers disappeared, leaving only their belongings behind. Realizing that he had found himself in a situation similar to those described in the diary, Mark ran back to the platform, but the train was already gone. he heard sounds resembling human voices coming from the forest. In a panic, he ran towards these voices, hoping to find a way out. After some time, he found himself on an old bridge leading into the endless forest. The fog enveloped everything again, and Mark felt something invisible pulling him back to the train. He realized that this train would never leave him, and he had become part of its endless journey. Years passed, and legends of the night train began to surface. Passengers who boarded this train never returned. It is said that Mark also became part of this cursed route, and his whisper can sometimes be heard among the sounds of the night forest.